Afternoon or evening, wherever you are, everyone, and welcome to today's live webinar from MyGuru. We're going to be going over just some basics on the GRE and GMAT. I am MyGuru's Director for Online Instruction, and I'm going to talk through the first part of our little presentation here this morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on where you are. And then I'm going to have Anjali Bhatia with Crimson Education speak a little bit more holistically about the MBA application process, specifically as COVID-19 kind of changes higher education globally, at least in the short term. So we'll go ahead and dive right in and just kind of talk about some fast facts for the GRE. So the GRE is accepted by most MBA programs these days. The GRE is kind of the catch-all for graduate admissions exams. And it's used to be for pretty much any non-MBA or non-law degree program, but now for about 10 years or so, most MBA programs will accept the GRE in lieu of the GMAT. And in fact, there are some law programs that are now accepting the GRE as well. There is no combined score for the GRE. You only get an individual quantitative and verbal score on a scale of 130 to 170 on individual points. And roughly for many folks, a 160 is kind of a goal score, just generically for the GRE. Now, you have 5, 30, or 35-minute sections, quantitative or verbal alternating. They will come in any order, 30 minutes for each verbal section, 35 minutes for each quantitative section, and then you have a 60-minute to start the exam. And there are 2 essays as part of that analytical writing section, and that is double the amount of essay that you would have on the GMAT. There are going to be 4 of those quantitative and verbal sections that are scored and 1 that is unscored. So this is another thing that is different from the GMAT. Both of the sections that most people care about on the GMAT are scored, while there may be unscored individual questions. You'll never know which they are. On the GRE, there are going to be 4 sections, 2 of each that are scored on that, that go into that scale of 130 to 170, and that 1 unscored section. Now, the ETS who put forth the GRE, they have a GRE to GMAT conversion tool that is available online. So if you are thinking about applying to business school with the GRE, that is probably your best resource, for kind of comparing the score that you got for the GRE versus what a school might be asking for on the GMAT. Generally, scores are published more readily for the GMAT than the GRE when it comes to business school kind of websites and that sort of thing. Now, it is probably the preferred entrance exam for most global MBA programs. There are obviously most schools that will take the GRE, but if you had to ask a MBA admissions person which they would prefer you take, they will almost certainly say the GMAT. Now, the GMAT has the combined score on a scale of 200 to 800, and it incorporates the quantitative and verbal sections. Now, the quantitative and verbal are scored independently as well on a scale of 0 to 60 for each. Roughly, you can expect that your range should be between about a 10 to a 50 or 51 on the quantitative, and about a 10 to a 45 or so on the verbal. 2 approximately 60-minute multiple choice scored sections. So that's going to be the quantitative and the verbal. The quantitative is actually exactly 62 minutes. The verbal is actually exactly 65 minutes, but approximately an hour for each section. And then you have the vestigial tails of the GMAT. You've got a 30-minute essay and a 30-minute integrated reasoning section that are each scored separately and do not go into the overall score scale. The essay is scored on a scale of 0 to 6 and in half-point increments, and the integrated reasoning is scored on a scale of 1 to 8 in single-point increments. Both of these scores are significantly less prioritized, we'll say, for most admissions folks globally. There's just not nearly as much emphasis on the essay, especially as compared to the overall 800 score that most people are more familiar with. And the integrated reasoning, though, has been gaining a little bit of traction. So try to make sure that your IR score is at least somewhat commensurate to uh, your quantitative and verbal and overall percentiles. As at least anecdotally, I can speak to say that I have had a student need to retake the exam solely for the IR section. This is usually a scenario that presents itself more in Europe than in North America. But again, the IR, they're pushing that harder than the essay. The essay is definitely the least important part when it comes to GMAT. Considerations for GRE versus the GMAT. So we'll start with the GRE. So we'll have some pros and some cons. So the biggest pro for the GRE is that it comes with an online calculator. Now, it's a terrible calculator. It's not scientific. It's not like your TI-83 back in high school or in college. It's just a little basic 4-function with a square root button interface locked calculator that comes out of the GRE testing software. But it is there, so you can use it to perform basic 4-function calculation. Now, a con on the quantitative side for the GRE is it actually has more quantitative concepts than the GMAT does. The GRE, when it gets to the harder questions, and the GRE is adaptive by section as opposed to the GMAT, which is adaptive by question. When you get into the harder second section, you can see some more obscure quantitative concepts, especially as it pertains to coordinate geometry. You can see things about circles and ellipses and hyperbolas in the GRE on like the harder questions when they're really trying to differentiate you from like the top like 167, 168, 169, 170 range. And it's just the way that that exam goes. Whereas on the GMAT, you're not going to see a hyperbola. Now, one of the other pros is, and actually I've got that should say no data sufficiencies. On the GRE, it should say no data sufficiency. You have quantitative comparisons as opposed to data sufficiencies. So the data sufficiency is the harder question on the GMAT, and the quantitative comparison is what you've got instead on the GRE. So that should say quantitative comparisons, not no quantitative comparisons. Chalk that up as a typo from earlier. But then a con on the GRE is that it tests the vocabulary as opposed to the GMAT, which does not. So GRE verbal sections, approximately 50% vocab. So you're going to have to do some vocabulary study on the GRE where you won't have to do that for the GMAT. Then generally on the GRE, you can expect an easier quantitative section, which is to a degree a pro and a con. The pro about it is that you do have generally easier questions, but you have less margin for error on the GRE. Then on the GRE, it generally tests a little bit more difficultly on the verbal side. The verbal side of the GRE is going to have longer reading comprehension, and as we're already going to have vocabulary. So you just have to be aware of that. You have shorter sections though on the GRE, which is for most people a positive, those 30, 35-minute sections, but you also have less time per question. So these are just some of the considerations that you'll want to think about when you are deciding whether you want to go with the GRE versus the GMAT. Considerations. We'll also talk some pros and cons. So one of the pros about the GMAT is you actually get to choose what order you want to put your exam sections in. So you can decide whether you want to start with the essay and the analytical writing or leave those two things that don't matter to the end of the exam. So the essay for the GRE is kind of one of the bigger things that folks don't like because you have to spend an hour writing those essays before you get to the content that really matters, especially if you're using the GRE in an MBA application scenario. So being able to put the integrated reasoning and the essays to the end after the quantitative and the verbal, and knowing which order you're going to go in, quantitative or verbal and quantitative first, is usually a pro for most test takers. But the big con for the GMAT, no calculator. So you have to do all of your calculations on the GMAT manually. And that's, for a lot of people, kind of the thing that pushes them to the GRE is that you have to do all of it. But again, GMAT has no vocabulary. So you don't have to worry about being able to define obscure terms like abecedarian. What else can we come up with? You know, a haberdashery, for instance. So that's one of the benefits of the GMAT. you don't have to worry about studying vocabulary. But there is a higher quantitative difficulty that we kind of talked about in the GRE concepts. The individual questions are generally harder, but you've got fewer just obscure esoteric things like graphing circles. Now, a pro, you do have more time per question, both in the quantitative and the verbal section. So quantitative, you can average about 2 minutes per question on the GMAT. It's only about 1:45 for the GRE. For the verbal, you're at about 1:50 or so for the GMAT. You're only at about 1:30 for the GRE. So you get more time per question. Pardon me. One of the cons, though, while it doesn't test vocabulary, is it does test grammar. So if you have trouble with grammar and are actually better at vocabulary, again, that may push you towards the GRE. But you will need to, for the sentence correction portion of the GMAT, be able to evaluate some basic grammar conventions, whether it's verb tenses, pronouns, subject-verb agreement, modifiers, parallelism, and some degree of idiom. So that's probably where more memorization skills will be focused as opposed to vocabulary as it pertains to the GMAT verbal. Then the pro, it is an overall shorter exam. While the sections themselves are longer, you do get a shorter overall test just because there isn't that experimental section, that unscored section that you won't know what it is in the GRE. Here in the GMAT, you know everything matters, so you can focus on each section as is required by just kind of the endeavor. And if you prefer a shorter test, the GMAT probably is for you. And again, the essay is significantly less important on the GMAT. So that's something that you can kind of coast through in a lot of cases because for most graduate programs, really looking at where they will prefer to evaluate your writing skills based on your application essay as opposed to either the GMAT or GRE essays. The GRE essays are a little bit more focused on because of such a wider application use case for the GRE. For instance, I have had a student who wanted to go to get a PhD in English at Cornell, for instance, and they needed a 6 on the GRE essay. I can assure you that there is no business school out there that will be requiring a 6 on any GRE essay. So high level, those are your considerations as you work through thinking about the GRE versus the GMAT. And at this point, bring in Angela, who's going to just kind of talk through some of the concerns about the coronavirus and how MBA applications are potentially being impacted by the situation globally. So, Anjali.
Awesome. First of all, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. So if you want to go ahead to the next slide. First off, who am I? I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, but I'm from Crimson Education. We're one of the leading consulting firms in helping young professionals apply